Good afternoon. You are on a webinar entitled Decal Research into Advocacy. This webinar is being hosted by the Center for Injury Research and Prevention at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. I am Suzanne Hill, and I am Director of Advocacy and Outreach for the Center, and I will be moderating today's webinar. I thank you all for taking time from your busy schedule to join us for this webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to address a few housekeeping items. First, if you're having technical difficulties, please reread your confirmation emails. The latest one was sent this morning. In the emails, you will find links to join the meeting and to download WebEx Event Manager for first-time users. You will hear the audio of today's webinar through your computer speakers. There is not a call-in phone number for the audio. At this point, CHOP will not be able to help you with technical issues. If you have questions for the presenters as we go along, and we encourage them, please type them into the Q&A text box in the bottom of your screen and direct them to our host. I will collect and prioritize them by looking for common threads in the questions. At the conclusion of today's presentation, we will address as many of the questions as possible. Because of the large group, it is not possible to open up the lines for live audio questions. Also, other attendees will not be able to view the questions or comments you submit. From previous webinar feedback, we've learned this is very distracting for the attendees. So here's our agenda for the remainder of this hour. After a quick primer on GDL, we will spend about 20 minutes talking about the theory and evidence behind graduated driver license decals, also known as vehicle identifiers, followed by practical advice about advocating, implementing, and communicating about a GDL decal provision based on New Jersey's own experience. At the conclusion, we hope you will feel comfortable describing the research and theory behind GDL decals, address the legislators' what about questions, and that you feel prepared to create a GDL legislative advocacy plan that may or may not include the decal provision. You know your state best. What you hear today is also summed up in a two-sided fact sheet from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia's Boost Your GDL Fact Sheet series that you can use to support your advocacy for stronger GDL laws in your state. This is available as event material on the event information page when you logged in for this event, and it's also available from teamdriversource.org. And lastly, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted at teamdriversource.org within the next week. Because there are attendees on the call who may have limited understanding of the purpose of graduated driver licensing systems, I'll provide a quick primer. This slide summarizes an optimal GDL policy according to recent expert consensus. First, GDL is an experience-based method for beginning drivers to earn driving privileges that are introduced in phases. The first phase is a learner-supervised driving phase, then they move into the intermediate or solo driving phase, and then after that, they move into full stage with unrestricted driving, obeying the traffic laws for their state. GDL works by keeping novice drivers out of high-risk driving situations, such as at night and with peer passengers, while they are given the chance to develop driving skills in lower-risk situations, such as driving during the day and without peer passengers, and by giving them time to gain needed on-road experience before driving under more challenging conditions. GDL is one of the few interventions proven effective at reducing fatal teen crashes. States with comprehensive GDL programs have been able to reduce fatal crash risk among 16-year-old drivers by 40%. So where do GDL decals fit into this process? Decals are vehicle identifiers that alert law enforcement to a vehicle with a driver that has a learner permit or an intermediate license. The main purpose of the decal is to allow law enforcement to easily ID a driver that is violating his license restrictions, such as driving at night or with passengers or using their cell phone. While New Jersey is the first jurisdiction in the U.S. to require vehicle identifiers, its decal is modeled after those of international jurisdictions. Decals have been used by other countries for decades to help law enforcement identify novice drivers. Countries include Great Britain, Australia, Canada, France, Japan, Israel, among others. Generally, these implementations have been successful. There haven't been any negative consequences, and they're well accepted by parents and teen drivers. Because these countries implemented the decals at the same time as the rest of their GDL provisions, public health scientists have not been able to isolate and study the effect of vehicle identifiers. In May of 2010, New Jersey presented us with the first opportunity to isolate the decal provision and evaluate changes in crash rates. This was 5 years ago this month. So in that provision, the decals applied to learner and drivers that had learner permits and probationary licenses and were under the age of 21. The decals must be on the front and back license plates of the vehicles, and in New Jersey, they look like they are a reflectorized Velcro sticker, as you can see here in the image. Those that do not comply with having their decal will receive a fine of $100. And so one last point of context for today's presentations is to address the, well, why now? States with comprehensive GDL programs have realized significant reductions in teen crash rates over the past decade, but many are now seeing these rates plateau. So you can see here from a news article story in the Oregonian, the state of Oregon feels that they're having they're seeing a plateau effect in their crash rates. This article is from came after a teen driving crash, and I'll just read it here. In 1999, the state passed a graduated driver license law for people under 18. Over the next 8 years, the number of crashes involving teen drivers plummeted 29%. But since 2008, the progress has flattened. Oregon's GDL program may have reached the limits of its ability to reduce serious crashes on the roads. Troy Costales said, with things leveling off, the question from a legislative point of view is, what's the next step? What else can we do? This past year, the National Safety Council released an expert panel report on an integrated GDL framework to help states reinvigorate their GDL programs with the latest evidence. One of their recommendations is having a decal provision. Today, we feature two panelists that are extremely familiar with New Jersey's GDL decal provision. Pam Fisher knows it because she led the advocacy, education, and implementation efforts back in New Jersey back in 2010. Allison Curry knows it because as an epidemiologist at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, she was able to link the right databases together to rigorously evaluate crash rates among intermediate driver license holders for 4 years before the law went into effect and for 2 years post-implementation. Now for formal introduction, Dr. Allison Curry is Senior Scientist and Director of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the Center for Injury Research and Prevention at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Allison is the Principal Investigator of CHOP's New Jersey Traffic Safety Outcomes Program, which includes the recent research on decal. Pam Fisher is Principal of Pam Fisher Consulting of Hackettstown, New Jersey. Pam formerly led the New Jersey Teen Driver Study Commission, which proposed the decal. She also served as Director of the New Jersey Division of Highway Traffic Safety, which worked with the legislature and the governor to get the provision passed and then implemented. I will now turn the mic over to Dr. Curry. There'll be a slight delay here as we get the new slides up. Yep.
Thanks, Suzanne. So I thought I would start by walking through how decal provisions are hypothesized to lead to crash reduction. So decal provisions are thought to do a number of things. First, to increase police's ability to enforce important GDL restrictions, such as passenger limits and nighttime driving bans. Also, to increase teen drivers' willingness to comply with these restrictions and other traffic safety laws, and to decrease their engagement in higher risk driving behaviors. And finally, to alert other drivers that they are sharing the road with an intermediate driver. And ultimately, this is thought to lead to a reduction in crashes and resulting injuries. There are a few things that I wanted to point out about this that I think are more subtle but very important. The first is that decal provisions may lead to crash reduction even if compliance with the decal provision itself isn't complete. As you can see by the graph, display of the decal is not necessarily in the critical pathway to crash reduction. For example, intermediate drivers may be more motivated to drive more safely even when they're not displaying the decal, to avoid being cited for a violation of GDL provisions. This is the main reason why we have evaluated the decal's effect among all intermediate drivers. The second point is that we don't expect a direct effect of increased police enforcement on crashes. And you can see that in this picture here by the lack of an arrow between restrictions and enforcement. It really works through motivating behavior change, either among the teen drivers and or other road users. In other words, we wouldn't really expect increased police enforcement itself to lead to a substantial crash reduction in the absence of some sort of change in driver behavior. So our evaluation at CHOP ran from 2011 to 2014. Our work was not funded by or done in collaboration with New Jersey agencies. It was independently funded by 3 small grants from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, and then a grant from State Farm Mutual Insurance Company. Although the New Jersey Motor Vehicle Commission and the Department of Transportation and the Office for Information Technology were all very supportive of the study and generously provided all the data that we needed for the study to us. I also just wanted to acknowledge my co-authors on this study, Dennis Durbin and Melissa Pfeiffer from CHOP, and then Michael Elliott from the University of Michigan. So our objective in our study was to examine the associations between the provision for the decal provision and licensing, enforcement of GDL restrictions, compliance with GDL restrictions, specifically the night and passenger restrictions, and then association between the provision and crash reduction. Data from our study came from 2 sources. The first was from the New Jersey Licensing and Registration Database, and this database includes information on the licensing phases and then on the date and type of driver events, such as citations and crashes. The second data source was New Jersey's crash database from 2006 to 2012. And unfortunately, the New Jersey crash report doesn't include the license status of the driver. So if we wanted to identify young drivers specifically with their intermediate license or their learner's permit, we had to link New Jersey drivers who were in crashes back to their corresponding unique record in the licensing database. And this had never been done before in New Jersey and had been done before only in a few other U.S. states. So we were able to match almost 99% of crash-involved New Jersey drivers back to their unique licensing record, which really speaks highly to the high quality of data that was collected both by the Motor Vehicle Commission on the licensing side and then on the Department of Transportation on the crash side. We then reconstructed the entire license history for every New Jersey driver, and we did this by identifying for each New Jersey driver for each month of the study, their exact age at the midpoint of every month, their license status at the midpoint of the month, so whether they had a permit, an intermediate license, a basic full license, whether their license was suspended, unlicensed, or had died, and then whether they had experienced each of the study outcomes in that month. We then calculated the monthly rate for each outcome of the study, and we did this by the denominator for each of these rates was the number of drivers who were in the intermediate phase on the 15th of each month. And the numerator was the number of intermediate drivers who experienced the outcome sometime in that specific month. We had data for a 4-year period prior to the decal provision becoming effective, and then 2 years after the provision. And we excluded February through April of 2010 from the analysis, and this was because there were major outreach efforts that had started in February, and decals were available for purchase starting in April of 2010. So with regard to the implementation's effect on licensing, the number of 17-year-old intermediate drivers in New Jersey remained stable at about 65,000 throughout the study period. This was also true for the number of new permits issued and the new number of intermediate licenses issued in New Jersey each month. And also the median age at intermediate license was 17.1 both before and after the decal's implementation. So it looks like the provision didn't deter teens from initially getting licensed, getting either their permit or their intermediate license. Also, the number of 18 to 20-year-olds who were not yet eligible to get a full license, so this is those that had their intermediate license less than 365 days, was also stable throughout the study period. On the other hand, the number of intermediate drivers who were eligible to get a full license decreased over 13% from April to May of 2010. And then there was a reciprocal increase, as you can imagine, in the number of 18 to 20-year-old licensed drivers. So there did appear to be this kind of rapid movement of teens from the intermediate to the full license phase in the few months after the decal provisions implementation. However, it looks like the effect was transient. You can see that the numbers begin to approach their pre-decal levels after about a year. So in addition to giving this graph and looking at licensing, in addition to it giving us a better understanding of how decal provisions affect licensing patterns, the changes in the number of intermediate drivers after the decal also highlight the importance of comparing crash rates and not just looking at the number of crashes before and after the decal. And this is because there were less intermediate drivers after the decal, one would already expect there to be less crashes after the decal. This figure shows the rate of intermediate drivers who were issued GDL citations by New Jersey law enforcement. And the dots here are observed GDL citation rates per 10,000 intermediate drivers. And then the red line is the predicted rate that sort of smooths out some of the month-to-month noise. And you'll see there was a rapid 50% increase at two time points. A 50% increase from March to April of 2009 when the provision was first enacted, and then again from March to May of 2010 as it went into effect. And overall, once we adjusted for gender and season, we estimated that over the first year, there was a 14% increase in the rate of GDL citations issued to intermediate drivers. If you look at the second year, though, you can tell that the increase in rates was not sustained long-term. And one thing to keep in mind here is that compliance and citation rates, the further you get out from the effective date, the more intimately linked compliance and citation rates are. So if you have an increase in compliance, you might expect a decrease in citation rates. It's unclear how much of this decrease was due to that, but what we do know is that there was a decrease back in the second year. In terms of compliance with GDL restrictions, the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety conducted a pre-decal survey and then several surveys in the post-decal period with both New Jersey teens and their parents. And in general, the study found that found incomplete compliance with GDL restrictions, and they didn't find much indication that compliance had increased after the provision. We're using a different set of methods to look at whether compliance and enforcement changed after the provision. Those analyses are still underway, and we're hoping to finish those up by the summer. But in total, there were over 400,000 pairs of decals that were sold in the first 2 years. So this is between April 2010 and about July of 2012. And this includes 140,000 in the first 3 months. And most of those, of course, were probably to existing intermediate and permitted drivers because there was no grandfathering of New Jersey's decal provisions. The number of decals looks to have stabilized in early 2011, and then since then has closely tracked the number of New Jersey permits issued each month. New Jersey teens are required to purchase the decals before they can get their permit, so this makes sense. And it's important to note that just because the new drivers are purchasing the decals doesn't necessarily mean that they're using them. So the IIHS surveys also asked parents whether the teens were using the decals. 1 year after the decal provision was passed, 46% of parents of intermediate drivers said that their teen had always displayed the decals. On a more recent survey done in New Jersey of sort of a new wave of parents of intermediate drivers, the proportion who said that they enforced the decal provision increased to 62%. And finally, with respect to overall police-reported crashes, intermediate drivers' crash rate after adjusting for gender and calendar month and gas prices in New Jersey decreased an estimated 1.8% per year before the decal, whereas the crash rate decreased over the 2 years after the decal about 7.9% per year. That right here. For some crash types, such as single vehicle crashes and pure passenger crashes, the provision appears to have had a particularly strong effect on 18 and 19-year-old drivers. And we don't know why that is, but it may have some implications because there were some recent national GDL studies which have reported an increase in crash rates among 18 and 19-year-olds in states that had strong GDL laws. So these findings may speak to a possible mechanism by which we can reduce crashes among these older teen drivers. To go into a little bit more depth of how we looked at crash rates, this graph specifically shows the observed monthly crash rates in New Jersey over the study period for 18-year-old male intermediate drivers. Females are not on this graph, but the estimates that I show here in terms of the rate of decrease also apply to them. So this is the observed rate, and then we use statistical modeling to estimate the rate for each month, adjusting for gender, calendar month, and gas prices. And that's the solid line here. We found that the rate of crashes for 18-year-old intermediate drivers decreased an estimated 1.1% per year in the 4 years before the decal. And as I said on the last slide, in the 2 years after the decal, decreased at a significantly higher rate at 8.6% per year. Finally, we wanted to determine what the expected trend would have been if the trend in the pre-decal period had just continued on into the post-decal period. So that is, if the decal had never been implemented, we would expect to just keep seeing the same rate that we had seen in the 4-year pre-decal period. And that's shown here in blue, the blue dotted line. In order to estimate the number of intermediate drivers whose crashes were prevented by the provision, what we did is we subtracted for each month the estimated number of crashes in the post-decal month, that's the red line, by the number that would have been expected if the decal had never been implemented, and that's the blue line. And then we summed across months. And when we did this, we estimated that 3,197 intermediate drivers had crashes that were prevented in the post-decal period. Another way of saying this is that about 3,200 additional intermediate drivers would have been expected to be involved in a police-reported crash had the decal not been implemented. So I think it's important to touch on our ability to make causal inferences, and that is to conclude that the decrease that we saw in the post-decal period was attributed to the decal provision as opposed to some other factors. And this is one of the questions that I get asked the most. So at its core, our ability to make causal inferences depends on a few things. One is the comparability of the intermediate driver groups with respect to crashing before and after the decal was implemented. So did the underlying population of intermediate drivers have about a similar risk of crashing in the 4 years before and the 2 years after the decal being implemented? And also our ability to adequately control for other crash-related factors that may have changed over the study period. And so we go into more detail about this in the discussion of our manuscripts, but briefly, there were no other statewide teen driver initiatives that were introduced during the post-decal period that would have explained the large decline. We also controlled for what we thought were the primary crash-related factors that may have differed between intermediate drivers in these two periods. In particular, gas prices as a proxy for changes in driving exposures that might have occurred due to economic conditions. And we also showed in the manuscript that the decrease in crash rates does not look like it was due to the concurrent change in New Jersey in their night restriction. So their night restriction changed from midnight to 11:01 p.m. However, as in every epidemiologic study, we can't absolutely rule out the possibility that the decline was at least partly due to some observed or unknown factor that changed from the post-decal to the pre-decal period. And so just circling back now to that causal pathway in the beginning, I think what we know so far is that there is an association between the decal provision and a reduction in police-reported crashes for intermediate drivers. But we don't yet have a clear picture of the specific mechanism by which it is reducing crashes. Our work certainly pointed to an increase in law enforcement, which is encouraging, but that seemed to be limited to the first year. And analyses done so far in compliance with GDL night and passenger restrictions haven't suggested an increase after the provision. So it really looks as though the picture is more complex than that. It could be, for example, that there was a general improvement in safe driving among intermediate drivers or older drivers. And this would be far more difficult to measure than compliance with the night and passenger restrictions. When it comes to young drivers with learner permits, the causal mechanism and potential for crash reduction was actually less clear. So the rate of conviction for GDL violations among young drivers with permits is already very low. A recent naturalistic study found that drivers with permits are virtually always accompanied by an adult supervisor, which suggests that they already have very high rates of compliance with GDL provisions. Young drivers with permits also already experience much lower crash rates, which leave less room for improvement via intervention. So it wasn't surprising that we didn't find a significant change either in the citation rate or the crash rate of young drivers with permits. And as you can see here, the rate of the decline was estimated to be 4.6% in the pre-decal period and about 0.6% in the post-decal period, and this was non-significant. So there really was no significant change in the crash rates among young drivers with their permits. Given that there are few non-complying learner drivers on the road, even if police are given more opportunity to enforce these GDL restrictions, it would be difficult to increase compliance enough among learner drivers to have a substantial increase on crash rates. On the other hand, it is possible that requiring decal use during the permit phase may help to establish safe driving behaviors in the intermediate phase, and in that way have a positive effect. But we just don't know the extent to which it does that. I'm showing here for you a list of the peer-reviewed published papers on this topic. The first three are from us at CHOP, and then the second two are from the Insurance Institute of Highway Safety. So please feel free to email us if you would like a copy of any of these articles.
Thank you, Dr. Curry. We're now going to transition the presentation over to Pam Fisher. So I'll load this up. Give the privileges over to Pam. Pam, you're now in control of the mouse.
Okay, can you hear me?
We sure can. Thank you.
Terrific. Okay, thanks everybody. Hi, and thanks for joining us today. And I always say this, and I don't mean to embarrass Dr. Curry. I call her Allison, but she has been such a tremendous force for the work we're doing here with the GDL Decal, and I can't thank her enough. And I've learned a lot from her. She's taught me an awful lot about the work that she does. So thank you, Allison, for your leadership on this. Okay, let me get to my slides. There we go. Okay, so my job is to talk to you about how we got where we are today in terms of change to our graduated driver's license law, as well as the implementation process and what we've learned over these last 5 years. And I think if someone had told us 5 years earlier, if we could roll back the clock and say that we would have made it to this point, I'm not sure, considering some of the craziness we went through when this all started. So let's jump into this, and I will walk you through what we've got here. Just a little bit of background so you understand, how far we have come in terms of our graduated driver's license law. And I think this is important for everybody because it is an evolving process. You don't always get what you want the first time out of the gate. But before we had graduated driver's licenses, we had a really, really weak program here in New Jersey. As you can see from the slide, we really had no real restrictions. You could basically get a permit, wait 20 days when you were 17 and go take your driving test. And that was it. You were off and running. And some states at that time, prior to GDL really coming into full force in the mid-90s, some states had, restrictions on driving at night and other things, but we didn't have anything. So it was really just, hold your permit for a short period of time, practice a little bit, and then go take your test, and that was it. So it was not a good system. And so in 2001, we enacted our GDL program. We actually got the legislation passed in the late 90s, and it was implemented in 2001. And we went from having pretty weak to pretty strong. We still permit at 16 in New Jersey, but in order to get a permit, you have to take 6 hours of behind-the-wheel training. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as how it relates to the decal as well. Actually, Suzanne mentioned it briefly. We do have the oldest probationary or intermediate licensing age in the nation at 17. And what's really interesting about our GDL program is you don't age out of the program at 18. So if you decide, I'm just going to wait until I'm 18 and then go get my permit and get my license, you can't do that. Our GDL program applies, the full program applies to all teens under the age of 21. Anybody under 21 for the first time has to go through the full GDL program. And if you're 21 or older, you go through a shortened version. It's a 3-month permit, 6-month probationary license, but there is no decal restriction for those under 21 because the restrictions are a little bit different. So you can see we had a nighttime driving restriction, no electronic devices of any kind, including handheld and hands-free cell phones. We have a primary seatbelt law in New Jersey, so it is primary for everybody in the vehicle. And we also had a passenger restriction that was a bit confusing. You could have one non-family member and as many family members as there were seatbelts, and that was very, very difficult to enforce. So in 2010, I should stop there. Let me stop for a second. In 2007, we had a legislatively mandated commission. We had a series of fatal teen crashes in 2006 that really kind of brought everything to a head, and there was a recognition that we needed to take a look at where we were. We were clearly seeing the crashes were coming down and fatalities were coming down, but it was just a really bad year. And so the commission formed. I had the privilege of chairing the commission, and it was made up of some legislators, but a lot of people from the community who really just cared about this issue. And we issued a report that we're still using today. It has 47 recommendations, 14 priority recommendations, and one of them was for some kind of an identifier, because we heard loud and clear from law enforcement as well as teens that, teens knew police were having a hard time enforcing the GDL provisions, and police said we can't enforce them if we don't know who the GDL holders are. So that was really the impetus for us to make that recommendation to aid with enforcement. And Governor Corzine signed the bill in 2008, and it took effect in 2010. And it is called Kylies Law, named after a teen who was one of 2 killed in a crash involving a teen driver. And that is Kylie's pictured there. And I've got to give props to her mom, Donna Weeks, who also was leading a separate push for legislation, and she really helped us make this happen too. So in 2010, the law changed. We have a 1-passenger limit now. Doesn't matter if they're a sibling or not. It's a 1-passenger limit, an earlier driving restriction, and of course the decal. And what's really important to note here is teens who want to get a permit at 16, they don't actually go buy their permits in New Jersey. They have to be purchased by the driving school instructor because they are required to do at least 6 hours of behind-the-wheel training. So what we're seeing is that a lot of our driving school instructors, and we have a fairly robust commercial driving school market here in New Jersey, are going and actually buying the permit. They're buying the permit and they're buying the decals in bulk, and they are then providing them to their students as part of their program. That was the case for me. I have a 19-year-old son, and when Zach did his behind-the-wheel training, his driving school instructor, the first thing he handed us was 2 sets of decals and said, you're going to need those for your vehicles, which I said, oh yes. And so it was a nice service. We're also seeing that some high schools are purchasing them in bulk, making them available to their students. So the main distributor is the Motor Vehicle Commission, or our DMV, but teens at, at 16, can't buy their own permits. So often this is what we're seeing happen, is that the driving schools are providing these for the students. So we have the decal, and it is, as I said, an identifier. It's designed to aid with being able to enforce the key restrictions, particularly the nighttime driving restriction and the passenger restriction, which we know through research are really proven to make a difference. So as Suzanne also said, this idea of identifier isn't a new concept. It's been used all over the country. And when the Teen Driver Study Commission was doing its research in this area, we spoke with people from other countries. We had some folks come in and talk to us as part of a panel to talk about their experiences in other countries where they learned to drive and how these decals were, widely accepted. In fact, in the UK, they're so widely accepted that you can buy them in the 7-Elevens, in convenience stores. They're everywhere. So the idea of making them readily available to folks is, I think, a great concept. The other thing that's important here is that really does reaffirm to our teens out there that police are going to enforce these provisions, as well as the seatbelt provision and the complete ban on cell phones and other electronics. It sends a strong message to them, and we think that's important because teens told us, we know without an identifier, without some way of knowing who we are, it's difficult for police to enforce your GDL law. Okay, now I'm trying to get my thing to move here. Okay, so from a public outreach perspective, I'm giving you a couple of links. One is a YouTube video of our 30-second public service announcement that was developed and was pushed out through our television outlets across the state. It was not a paid ad. We did public service, really indicating that the law is in effect. You need to get your decals. And when we filmed this, we used students from one of our high schools that were big supporters of the work we were doing in Being Safe Driving. So these are real high school students, and the image you see of the palm card on the screen that explains the decal provision in our GDL program. These were distributed across the state. They're still out there. We're pushing them out. We've been pushing them out for 5 years. So lots of partners have been distributing these, and police officers are using them as well. We also have a program called Share the Keys. It is a parent-teen orientation program, and the decal, as well as all of the components of our GDL program, are discussed during that program. It's about an hour-long program that's done at high schools and other locations around the state. And there's an explanation about how the decal came to be, and that it is a part of our GDL law. And if teens are stopped for some reason and a police officer sees that they don't have the decal on the vehicle, they can be cited. It's a $100 fine, no points, and that is the fine for any violation of our GDL law. $100, but no motor vehicle points. I think the other thing that's important to note too, just real quickly about other partners, it's something for you all to think about if you're seriously considering a decal, is making sure that you reach as many partners as you can to help distribute the materials, as well as help possibly sell the decals. In our case, the decals are $4 a pair, and that in legislation, our legislation that established the decal program says that the Motor Vehicle Commission may only charge what is the actual cost to develop and distribute the decals. They actually cost more than $4 a pair, but that's what they are charging, is $4. So, working with high schools, some high schools, as I said, are purchasing them in bulk, driver training instructors, the commercial driving school owners, law enforcement. We've had some police departments purchase them. There are lots of partners, insurance companies, who can help distribute the information as well as make decals available to their insurers who have teams. So think about, what the ability is to partner with folks if you decide to go in this direction. I think it's really, really important to identify your partners early on, get them on board, help them understand the hows and the whys of the decal and your GDL program. and that will go a long way in really pushing out the information. From a law enforcement perspective, and I've heard this for a long time. I mean, I've been working in teen driving for a number of years, but it's really critical that we make sure that our law enforcement officers really understand graduated driver's licensing, that they understand how it works and why it works. When they do, they're going to be more inclined to enforce it, and that starts at the top with the chief of police all the way down to the folks that are in the office themselves who may be answering questions from the public. Everybody needs to understand how and why GDL works and the crash risk for teens. So they're often the last to know, though, when we change laws. And in our state, I will be honest with you, when our GDL law took effect in 2001, police weren't trained. And as I note on the slide, they didn't grow up with GDL, they don't understand how or why it works. So it's really important that you get them on board and make sure they understand the details. They also need to have standard operating procedures in place for dealing with teens who not only don't have the decal, but may have multiple passengers in the car and may be driving at night. What are you going to do when you stop that teen who doesn't have a decal? Are you going to escort them back to the police station and have them get a set from the police department or to the motor vehicle agency? What are you going to do? It's really important to help them understand that. The other thing that we've done in the last few years is we provided a GDL card. It's a laminated card to police officers around the state that on one side lists the provisions of the GDL law, the various components of it. On the other side, it's a section on enforcement, and it talks about the decal. We've recently updated this to talk a little bit more about the ideology behind it, why, the importance of protecting teens because they're such a high-risk age group, and also the efficacy associated with the decal that speaks to Dr. Curry's research, particularly, the decrease in teen crashes for those probationary drivers, and the reduction overall, and how important that is. And so when you help the police officers, I like to say connect the dots a lot, but when you help them do that, they're more likely to enforce the provisions of the GDL program. And that's, we think, is absolutely, goes back to what we said all along. We're giving them an identifier that they can use to identify GDL holders, but we then need to make sure that they stop those teens who may be violating the provisions of our law. Now, I would be, lying if I said that this law wasn't without controversy. And when we produced the report back in 2008, we had a press conference with the governor, and I think every media outlet in the New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia metropolitan area was there. The media loved the idea of the decal, thought it was the greatest thing since sliced bread, lots of editorials about it. Wow, this is so good, makes sense, terrific. When we then saw the law take effect in May of 2010, and there was a bit of backlash from the public, all of a sudden the media said, where did this idea come from? This is crazy. This is a scarlet letter. What are we doing? We're setting up teens for, terrible things to happen. Well, we quickly responded and said, it's not a new concept. We pointed to its use around the world. And then the Attorney General at the time did survey police departments 6 months and another 6 months after the decal took effect and found no substantiated cases of the decal being connected to a crime, to any incidents where, someone was put at risk. And I will tell you that we still have parents who say, I refuse to let my teen, particularly a female, put the decal in the car because they're going to be stalked. They're going to be, accosted by a predator. And we have responded to that by, of course, referencing the fact that they're used around the world, and we have found no substantiated cases there or in New Jersey through the report from the AG. We also remind parents that the #1 place that predators operate is on the internet. And so they need to be mindful of what their teens are doing online and what they're saying about their whereabouts. And we also point to the fact that cars, students' vehicles are often plastered with information about themselves already, and that the decal is a very tiny, nondescript, it doesn't say anything, little red piece of material that most people don't even know it's there or what it is. So, so this hysteria, is how I refer to it, has not materialized. We are not seeing teens being accosted. We are not seeing bad things happen. In fact, as Dr. Curry's research shows, the decal is helping us to drive down the crashes and save lives. And my final response when I talk to parents is, you know, the #1 cause of car crashes, the #1 cause of injury and death to teens is car crashes, not little red decals and predators. So we need folks to understand that and to keep, you know, an open mind about what we're doing here. And I say that not just as an advocate, but I'm the parent of a teenager. So I've lived and breathed this. And we're very encouraged by the fact that, you know, that the number of parents who say they're enforcing the decal has certainly gone up. The last main thing I want to share with you is we are celebrating our 5th anniversary of Kylies Law. And we are this month kicking off what we hope will be a long-term program. We call it the GDL Thank You program. And it was started by a traffic officer, a retired fatal accident reconstructionist actually, based in one of our northern counties, who said, you know what, let's thank the teens and parents who are using the decal. Let's do a positive reinforcement program. So we have police officers and others out there looking for teens using the decal and giving them the little thank you card you see posted, as well as a gift. And it's usually a gift card for maybe $3 to $5 for Dunkin' Donuts or Chipotle or a free ice cream or something like that. And the card reinforces that the decal is having a positive impact, but it also reminds teens and their parents that even after the teen has completed the GDL program, they're still at risk for crashing. The risk remains high. And so they need to continue to focus on, you know, being safe, minimizing distractions, keeping a lot of passengers out of the vehicle, really thinking about what they're doing. And we've kicked this off, and we've got schools and police departments working on this now. So we'd like to see this be an ongoing program. So real quickly, these are just some quick charts showing you our crash numbers are coming down. I get asked this all the time, but I think Allison's findings are what are really critical to today. We're seeing a downward trend in crashes, and we're also seeing a downward trend. If you had a trend line showing there for drivers who are 16 to 20 years of age, our teen drivers and their passengers. So I'm going to stop there, and I guess I'm going to turn it back to Suzanne.
Yeah, thank you, and wonderful job. And I just want to reiterate that as much of what you heard in these terrific presentations is also summarized in the Booster GDL fact sheet, which you can share with policymakers. And you know, hopefully you've gotten an in-depth understanding of some of these charts and stats that you see on these fact sheets, so that when you walk somebody through, you know, it will be easy to walk through the theory and the evidence behind the decals, and then you know, the what's in a Kylies Law and the precedents for them, and you know, some recommendations about how to communicate about a decal provision. The fact sheet also summarizes current best practice for GDL policy as recommended by MAP 21 and more recent research, and is also complementary to the National Safety Council's integrated GDL framework. Well, the presentations did generate some questions here, so I want to spend the rest, we have about 10 minutes left, and go through some of these questions and address them to Allie and Pam to make this webinar as actionable for you as possible. So one of the questions, which I guess I'll take right off the bat, I think I can take off the bat, is we've been getting some questions about what other states are considering decals. And yes, it's true, New Jersey is the only jurisdiction in the U.S. that has a decal presently. But we have been hearing from other states, including Washington, and these are basically people they're in various stages of just pulling together coalitions and doing the research they need to do, to having conversations with people, to actually having bills out there in front of legislators. So Maine has a bill in its workshop right now that would make it, I believe, a voluntary Decal Law. I'm not really sure, the specifics on how that would be implemented. Michigan has been considering something. Massachusetts and New York have had decal bills in the past, but I don't think they have gone through the legislature very far. And then we've also heard the state of Washington is also considering a decal, and they're on various levels of going through the process of becoming a bill in the law, and all have different types of provisions and are written in different ways. So those are what we know about other states considering decals.
Suzanne?
Yes.
This is Pam. New York State also has a couple of bills that have been out there for a period of time. So
okay, great. Okay, yeah, I knew they'd had bills. It's good to know that they're still working on it. So one of the questions came in early, and I think Pam can probably address this. So what happens to the money raised by the purchase of the decals? Are they put into some sort of teen driver safety programs, or do they basically just cover the cost of the decals themselves?
Yeah, I know. I think I referenced that in my slide. But the cost of the decal, the legislation that requires them says that the Motor Vehicle Commission, or DMV, may only charge what it costs to produce and distribute them. So the actual cost is more than $4. I believe it's $4 and change. But the MVC said we're going to charge $4. So that's what they charge. So the money is basically to cover the cost to produce them. And they are a Velcro type decal. The materials are selectorized. And so they literally just, you put the backing on the license plate, you can peel them on and off. And surprised nobody asked me about that. But yes, they are removable. And we did that because we know that there are families where there's multiple drivers in the same vehicle. So if you've got, more than one teenager and one may be a GDL holder and one may not, you can remove the decal. And some people say, well, you take it off, so what's the incentive for teens not to just leave them off? Well, if they're stopped and cited for some reason and they don't have the decal on, it's a $100 fine. So, so long answer to that question, but $4 covers the cost.
Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you. So we also have a question about what do we know about GDL violations that are written by law enforcement? Do you know an experience of them being dismissed by the judicial, or how do they control for that?
Yeah, well, here's the thing. First of all, our GDL provisions, if you violate any provisions in the law, it's a non-point carrying offense. There's no motor vehicle penalty points assessed. It's just a $100 fine for each of those things. So if you have too many passengers and you're driving after curfew, it would be $200. Each is a separate offense. We don't really see them being dismissed because there's no points. Basically, the teen or the parent pays the fine. The bigger issue was in point carrying violations, where say a teen is stopped for speeding. And what was happening is they were going to court and they were plea bargaining these things down. And so we went to the Attorney General and asked that plea bargaining for GDL holders stop. And so there is a directive from our Attorney General that took effect actually in 2009 that does not allow a teen to plea bargain out of the penalty points. They just can't do that. So, so that's really been I think, more important thing for us. So we really aren't seeing GDL violations being dismissed because, they're not going to court for those. What they're going to court for are the moving violations with points, and we really don't want those to be dismissed. So we've got a bit of a fall safe in place to help with that.
I'll just add to that. So the data that we got, the New Jersey administration of the courts directly populates their citation data into the licensing database. So we were lucky that we didn't have to go to another government source in order to get citation data. And of course, that reflects the final adjudicated violation. But as Pam just said, that because there's no plea bargaining for young drivers, it reflected the original violation. One thing I do want to say real quick is that we in the process of going through the citations, one thing we did come across is that we couldn't really look at the specific GDL citations for the specific provisions. So we wanted to be able to tell were the GDL citations that were written, say, for passenger violations increased. But because law enforcement most of the time cited this general statute and left off the letter that indicated which of the provisions the teen actually violated, we weren't able to look at whether like specific GDL provisions of citations increased or decreased. But we did note that over the after the decal was implemented, there was a change in how police wrote the tickets for GDL violations, and I think that's a good, that probably reflects all the training that Pam spoke about that New Jersey did. They were much less likely to write the general law as time went on than they were to cite the more specific statute. Before the decal, 30% cited the specific statute when they wrote a citation, and that just increased and increased up to 80% the last time we checked in July of 2011. So there was indication that police behavior in actually how they cited the GDL citations was, also was effective.
Thanks, Allie.
That's a good point. Can I just add something to that too, Suzanne? Allie said that, and this goes back to that little enforcement card. It's really important that states give police as many tools as possible to help them enforce GDL, because it's really hard and it's complicated. And so if you can simplify the statute and pull out the particular pieces for them, that will help you in the long run with your data collection efforts. That's huge, and we did that on that card.
Right. I think also you've helped to address some of the parental confusion too with good training of the DMV staff. So when they're getting handed their permit and their decal, et cetera, they're getting correct information from the DMV staffer, and perhaps some motivational or encouraging words about the decal, because that probably go a long way as well. Mm-hmm. We have been getting a couple questions. One is from the state of Washington. They're actually talking about the size of their decal and what it would look like, and wanted to know if there was any research on having a large sticker for the back window instead of a tab for the license plates. And right now there really isn't any research to evaluate, you know, if one design is more effective than another. But I know, Pam, you did it, your commission kind of looked at what the decal should look like, and you came to the conclusion that the decal was the way to go. Is there a reason behind that?
Yeah, it's really simple. Police are trained to look at the license plate. And so we have a front and a rear license plate in New Jersey, unlike a lot of states that just have the rear plate. So because they're trained to look there, we said, you know, doesn't it make sense to put it there? And several of our Teen Driver Study Commission members were law enforcement, and they concurred, and we then tested it. We actually had a couple of different colors, and we tried different things with law enforcement across the state. And there was general consensus that this was the way to go. So that's why it is what it is. That's why it's on the plate. And we also weren't looking to tell other drivers as much as we were using it as a tool for police. So that's why it's, you know, pretty simple.